This is a work of complete fiction created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. They laughed when he showed up with a car held together by borrowed parts and borrowed time. They stopped laughing when he crossed the finish line first. Nathan Cross spent 3 years in the quiet dark of a repair shop, rebuilding not just a machine, but everything they said he'd never be again. The man who designed the cooling system that made Titan Racing a dynasty watched from the outside while someone else wore the credit like a championship jacket. Now, in the most brutal desert race on the circuit, with no sponsor, no team, and no margin for error, Nathan has one shot to make the record say something different. If you've ever been written off by someone who didn't understand what you were capable of, stay with this story until the end. Hit the like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see how far this one travels. The exhibition hall smelled like money. That particular combination of industrial carpet cleaner, expensive cologne, and the faint petroleum ghost of machines that had never touched a dirty road. Nathan Cross had been inside rooms like this before, back when he used to belong in them. That was a long time ago. He moved his truck slowly through the service entrance of the Meridian Auto Pavilion, the trailer behind him swaying with the weight of something covered in a canvas tarp, the color of old concrete. The event organizers had given him Bay 47, which was near the loading dock, close enough to the dumpsters that when the wind shifted, he could smell last night's catering. He'd almost laughed when he read the assignment confirmation email. Almost. He backed the trailer in without help. 3 years of working alone had taught him to stop waiting for assistance that wasn't coming. The canvas came off in 2 pulls. Underneath sat a racing machine that looked, to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, like a pile of contradictions. The chassis was fabricated steel, hand-welded in sections. The seams ground smooth but not painted over. The body panels were mismatched. A composite hood, an aluminum rear cowl, a side pod that Nathan had shaped himself over a plywood buck in the back of his shop on Route 9 outside of Flagstaff. The tires were race compound rubber, the only new things on the entire build, and they looked almost comically purposeful against everything else. Nathan walked around the car once with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at it the way a man looks at something he's poured too much of himself into to see clearly anymore. The cooling ducts along the engine bay were his design, his geometry, a system he'd spent the better part of 4 years developing before it was taken from him. What sat in the car now was a version he'd rebuilt from memory, improved in the places where memory is more honest than original documentation. He plugged in the diagnostic tablet and checked the thermals. Everything sitting exactly where it should. That's interesting. He turned. A woman in a charcoal blazer was standing at the edge of his bay, holding a tablet of her own, one of the event staff lanyards hanging around her neck. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the car with her head tilted at a slight angle, the way people look at something they're trying to categorize. "The intakes," she said. "Those aren't standard positioning." "No," Nathan said. "They're not." She looked at him then. Mid-30s maybe, sharp eyes. She wrote something on her tablet and moved on without another word. Nathan watched her go for a second, then went back to his thermals. By the time the exhibition opened to the public at 9, the Meridian Pavilion was filling with the particular crowd that attended these things. Engineers, team representatives, the occasional automotive journalist, a scattering of wealthy enthusiasts who treated racing technology the way collectors treated art. The real money was clustered in the front half of the building, around the featured exhibits, where Titan Racing had placed their newest prototype under dramatic lighting. Nathan had walked past it on the way in. The car was beautiful in the way that something produced by a $200 million operation with unlimited engineering resources tends to be beautiful. Every surface optimized, every component sourced from a supplier who charged accordingly. He had stood in front of it for maybe 30 seconds before walking to his bay. He was recalibrating the sensor array when he heard the group coming from the main hall. He knew the sound before he saw them. The particular cadence of a corporate entourage, the way footsteps change when people are being guided rather than walking freely. Miranda Cole entered the bay first, in the sense that she was at the front of the group, though she wasn't looking at Nathan's car yet. She was finishing a conversation with someone on her left, Something about a supplier contract, her attention still wholly invested in whatever mattered to her 2 minutes ago. Miranda was 51, the kind of person who had run a major racing organization for so long that authority had stopped being something she projected. It was simply something she inhabited. She wore it the way other people wore glasses. Behind her was Logan Pierce. Nathan felt the stillness move through him the way cold water moves through a copper pipe, fast and clean and leaving nothing behind it. Logan Pierce was 44 and looked exactly as Nathan remembered him, which was to say that 3 years had been kind to him in the way that they are kind to men who sleep well. He was taller than most of the people around him, which he'd always known how to use. His suit was dark, and his hair was the same as it always was, and he was nodding at something the person beside him was saying with the specific, confident expression of a man who already knows how everything is going to turn out. Then Logan saw the car. Then Logan saw Nathan. The conversation he was nodding through stopped somewhere in the middle of a sentence. Nathan watched the recognition move through Logan's face, quick, instinctive, and then immediately controlled. His expression didn't change in any way that the rest of the group would have caught. But Nathan had spent years watching that face across engineering tables, and he caught it. Miranda had moved closer to the car now. She circled the nose with her arms crossed, her head moving in the slow, systematic pattern of someone actually looking rather than glancing. "Whose build?" she asked the air. "Mine," Nathan said. She looked up, studied him for a moment the way she'd studied the car. Without flattery, without hostility. Just assessment. "The cooling intake geometry," she said. "I've seen that principle somewhere." "You probably have," Nathan said. His voice was level. He let that sit. Logan stepped forward. "Miranda, the Castor team is expecting us in Bay 12. His voice was easy, the slight urgency in it completely naturalistic. "We should probably keep moving." Miranda looked at him, then back at Nathan's car. "What are you running under the hood?" she asked Nathan. "Reconfigured V8, displacement standard. Output is not." "Sponsor?" "Independent." She looked at the car again. Then, with the candid bluntness that had apparently served her well for 30 years, she said, "It looks like a student project. The finishing is rough." "The finishing is rough," Nathan agreed. "You're entering it in competition?" "Phoenix Desert Classic," Nathan said. "Week after next." Something moved through the group at that. A couple of polite, quickly suppressed sounds. Miranda didn't make one, but she didn't argue against them either. "That's a serious race for a machine at this stage," she said, and there was nothing overtly unkind in it. It was simply a statement of observed fact from someone who had seen a great many serious races. "I know what it is," Nathan said. Logan was watching him across the group now with an expression that was carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that takes work to maintain. He hadn't said anything directly to Nathan. Nathan hadn't looked at him directly either. The whole thing lasted maybe 4 minutes before Miranda Cole thanked him in the formal, abbreviated way that signals the end of a courtesy stop, and the group moved on toward Bay 12. Nathan stood next to his car and listened to the footsteps recede across the industrial carpet. After a while, he picked up the calibration tablet and went back to work. Route 9 outside Flagstaff was the kind of road that had clearly been more important once. There was a gas station a quarter-mile down that still had the bones of an old canopy over the pumps, though the pumps themselves had been gone for years. The shop sat back from the road behind a gravel apron big enough for 4 vehicles, which was usually 2 more than Nathan needed. He had rented the space 18 months ago from a man named Earl Duchamp, who was 76 and had run an auto repair business out of it for decades before his hands gave out. Earl had taken one look at Nathan's references, which amounted to a work history with a 4-year gap in the middle and a phone number for a former colleague in Denver, and rented to him anyway, which Nathan had appreciated more than he'd found a way to express at the time. The shop came with a lift, a compressor, and a collection of tool drawers that held a mixture of professional equipment and the kind of improvised solutions that accumulate over decades of fixing things with whatever was available. Nathan had spent the first month cataloging everything, not because he needed to, but because it helped him understand the space. He did legitimate work, oil changes, brake jobs, the occasional transmission, a wheel bearing here, and a fuel pump there. It kept the lights on and kept him connected to actual cars with actual problems, which he found valuable in a way that was hard to articulate to anyone who hadn't spent time losing themselves inside an engineering bubble. The Phoenix build lived in the back half of the shop. Behind a partition, Nathan had framed himself from 2x4s and corrugated sheet metal. It was a line that separated the paintwork from the other kind. He had started it with a donor chassis, a 30-year-old open-wheel frame he'd bought from a salvage auction in New Mexico for $600. The frame had been in a significant accident at some point, which was why it had ended up at auction. But the damage was at the nose and the main structure was straight. He knew because he'd measured it himself, on a flat surface, with a digital level and a string and a week of evenings before he committed to it. The cooling system was the core of the entire project. Everything else existed to serve it. When Nathan had developed the original system at Titan Racing 4 years ago, it had been in response to a specific problem. Desert racing destroyed conventional cooling setups because the airflow requirements at racing speeds were fundamentally in conflict with the thermal demands of sustained high-load engine operation in ambient temperatures that could reach 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The standard solution was to throw capacity at it. Bigger radiators, more coolant volume, higher flow pumps. The problem was that bigger meant heavier, and heavier meant slower. And in a race like Phoenix, where the mountain stages demanded both power and agility, you couldn't simply buy your way to an answer with mass. Nathan's original insight, developed over 8 months of systematic testing and iterative refinement, had been about airflow management rather than capacity. The geometry of the intake, the routing of the ducting, and the specific thermal mass distribution of the system he'd designed meant that it operated efficiently across a temperature range that would overwhelm conventional setups, using hardware that weighed significantly less than the alternatives. He'd presented it to Titan Racing's engineering leadership in the spring. Logan Pierce had been in that room. 6 months later, Logan had filed a patent application with Titan Racing's legal team, listing himself as the primary inventor. Nathan had found out through a former colleague who called him one evening, voice carefully neutral, reading the filing number out loud from a screen Nathan couldn't see. The termination had come 3 weeks after that. Restructuring, they'd called it. Nathan had signed documents in a conference room in Phoenix with a lawyer he couldn't afford sitting beside him, and he'd gotten a settlement that was enough to be insulting in both directions. Too much for Nathan to publicly claim the company hadn't paid him. Too little to actually matter. He'd spent the first 6 months after that doing things he wasn't proud of. Not dramatic things, just the quiet kind of self-destruction that looks, from the outside, like a man who's having a hard time adjusting to unemployment. He'd come out of it slowly, the way you come out of a fog. Not at one specific moment, but through a gradual accumulation of small decisions that eventually pointed in a consistent direction. The shop on Route 9 had been one of those decisions. The build had been another. The version of the cooling system in the Phoenix car was not identical to what Titan Racing had patented. Nathan had spent considerable time thinking about that, not for legal reasons, but for engineering ones. The original design had been good, but it had been developed under constraints that no longer applied. Working alone in a small shop without corporate resources had forced him to solve the same problems differently. The result was, he believed, genuinely better, more elegant, more adaptable, lighter by 4 kilograms, and capable of operating effectively at temperatures the original hadn't been designed to handle. He couldn't prove that in any official sense yet. He was planning to prove it in the desert. The registration desk for the Phoenix Desert Classic operated out of a motorhome in the paddock at the Sonoran Speedway, and the woman behind the clipboard was named Dee, and she had been running registration for the event for 11 consecutive years. And she looked at Nathan's entry form with the expression of someone who has seen many surprising things and is no longer capable of genuine surprise. "Independent entry," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's right." "No team support listed." "Correct." "Pit services?" "Self-managed." She looked up from the form, then at the trailer behind his truck. "That the car?" "Yes." She made a notation, stamped the form, and handed him a paddock pass. "Technical inspection is Saturday at 8. Bay assignments are posted at the main gate." He was assigned paddock space between a semi-professional amateur team from Colorado who ran a pair of older GT cars and a single-car entry from a young driver named Marco Vega, who had apparently qualified on raw speed alone, and whose team consisted of his father, his uncle, and a friend from college who had driven 12 hours to help. Nathan introduced himself to them the first afternoon. They were polite in the cautious way that paddock neighbors are polite when they're not sure whether the person next to them will be competition or just scenery. He set up his equipment methodically. Toolboxes, spare components organized by system, the fuel rig, the timing equipment. He didn't have a canopy, so he rigged a tarp on poles along one side for shade. It looked, he was aware, nothing like the setup he used to work out of when he was on the inside. Titan Racing was in the premium paddock section, which was at the other end of the facility. He knew because he'd looked at the entry list the week before, and Logan Pierce's name was there in the driver column, paired with Titan's newest prototype. The same car from the Meridian exhibition. The car with the cooling system that shared its fundamental architecture with work Nathan had done in a previous life. He finished setting up at 11:30 that night and sat in his truck eating a sandwich from the gas station down the road. The paddock had quieted down around him. Somewhere in the middle distance, a generator was running a steady background note. He looked at the car on the trailer and thought about what he was actually doing here. Not revenge. He'd thought about that word a lot over the past year, and every time he did it felt like the wrong frame. Revenge required the other person to register the wound, and Nathan had spent enough time around people like Logan Pierce to understand that they operated with a very selective definition of what constituted a wound inflicted versus an opportunity taken. Logan didn't lie awake at night feeling guilty. Logan had moved on, in the way that people move on when they've decided that what they did was simply the nature of how things worked. What Nathan wanted was simpler and harder to articulate. He wanted the record to say something accurate. He wanted a result that a person could point to and understand without any additional context required. He wanted to take what he'd built, this specific thing with its rough welds and mismatched panels and the cooling system he'd rebuilt from his own memory, and put it in the same race as the machine that was built on his stolen foundation. And he wanted to see what actually happened when the desert got hot enough to matter. That was it. That was the whole thing. He finished the sandwich, folded the wrapper, and put it in the bag. Then he climbed out of the truck and did one more walk around of the car in the dark, checking the tie-downs, checking the cover, checking the things that were already fine because he'd already checked them twice. Old habits from before, from when there had been a team to catch the things he missed. Now he was both the engineer who might miss something and the one who had to catch it. He'd gotten used to that over 18 months. He'd stopped finding it as frightening as he had at first. Technical inspection was Saturday at 8. The race started Sunday at 6 in the morning, when the desert was still cold and the stars were still visible, which was the only window before the heat arrived. He had 4 days. He set his phone alarm, got in the truck, and went to sleep. Technical inspection at the Phoenix Desert Classic was not designed to be comfortable for anyone, but it was particularly undesigned for comfort if you showed up alone with a car that looked the way Nathan's car looked. The inspection bay was a long open structure at the south end of the paddock, with fluorescent lighting that made everything look either fine or catastrophically wrong depending on the angle, and a team of 4 officials who moved through the checklist with the methodical patience of people who had learned, through experience, not to rush this part. Nathan pushed the car in on its dollies at 7:58 and positioned it under the center light. The lead inspector, a compact man in his 50s named Garrett, who wore his reading glasses on a cord around his neck, walked the car once without speaking. Then he pulled the glasses up and started reading frame numbers. Independent build, Garrett said. It had the same inflection D had used at registration. Not a question, not a judgment, just a notation. Yes. Garrett crouched by the left front suspension and looked at the fabrication on the lower control arm mount. He didn't say anything, which Nathan had learned over many years of inspection processes was either good or neutral, but was rarely bad. The man who doesn't comment is the man who isn't finding problems. The cooling system inspection took longer than the rest of the car combined. Garrett and one of the other officials spent 20 minutes on it, tracing lines, checking fittings, looking at the intake geometry from multiple angles. At one point, the second official said something quietly to Garrett that Nathan couldn't hear from where he was standing. Garrett responded with a single word that also didn't carry. "Pressure test," Garrett said finally, loud enough for Nathan. "Ready when you are." They ran the pressure test. Nathan watched the numbers on his own tablet while Garrett watched them on the official equipment. Nothing moved that shouldn't have moved. The system held exactly where it was supposed to hold. Garrett made his notation and initialed the form. "Cooling architecture is unusual," he said. "Not non-compliant, just unusual." "I know," Nathan said. Garrett looked at him over the reading glasses with the specific expression of a man who is trying to figure out whether he's looking at something significant. Then he signed the inspection sheet and handed Nathan his clearance sticker. "Good luck," Garrett said. And for once, in Nathan's recent experience, it sounded like it might actually mean something. The night before the race, Nathan didn't sleep particularly well, which was fine because he hadn't expected to. He lay in the bunk in the back of his truck with the windows cracked and listened to the paddock settle into its pre-race quiet. The occasional generator cycling, a door closing somewhere, the distant sound of an engine being started and then quickly shut off by someone running a late check. These were the sounds of people who were also not sleeping, which was its own kind of company. He got up at 3:30 and made coffee on the small propane unit he kept behind the seat. The coffee was bad. He drank it anyway and walked the car one more time in the dark, flashlight in hand, moving through his own mental checklist in the same order he always used, starting at the left front corner and working clockwise. The cooling lines were correct. The sensor placements were correct. The fuel system, the brake bias, the suspension geometry, all of it sitting where he'd put it, unchanged from the evening before. He checked the tire pressures and adjusted the right rear by 1/2 pound, and then stood back and looked at the car in the flashlight beam and thought about his former colleague in Denver who had called him with the patent filing number 4 years ago. His name was Dennis Farr, and he'd worked in Titan Racing's engineering department for 11 years. He'd called Nathan from his personal phone, not his work phone, which told Nathan everything he needed to know about the nature of the information and what it had cost Dennis to make the call. They hadn't spoken since. Nathan had never reached back out because he hadn't wanted to make things harder for Dennis. And Dennis had never reached out either, which Nathan understood for the same reason. He wondered sometimes whether Dennis knew about the Phoenix entry. The sporting press had picked it up in a small way. The independent entry with the hand-built machine was the kind of detail that made for a paragraph in the preview coverage, usually somewhere near the end of the article, after the legitimate contenders had been discussed at length. He finished the coffee and crushed the cup and put it in the trash bag hooked on the trailer hitch. The sky to the east had the first suggestion of something changing. Not light yet, but the particular quality of darkness that comes just before light. At 5 o'clock, he pushed the car to the pre-grid staging area and strapped in. The Phoenix Desert Classic started at 6 in the morning because the race organization had learned, across 40 years of running this event, that the only way to give competitors a fighting chance in the desert was to get as many miles under them as possible before the temperature climbed. The course covered 312 miles of mixed terrain, a paved opening section through the valley floor, transitioning to maintained gravel through the foothills, and then 60 miles of mountain stage through the Carrizo Canyon system, where the road narrowed to a single lane in places, and the drop on the outside of certain corners was long enough that the event medical team maintained a staging position at the canyon entrance. There were 28 entries. Nathan had qualified 17th based on his time trial results 2 days prior, which was exactly where his car's straight-line capability placed him against machines with significantly more power. He hadn't pushed for a better time because the time trial had told him what he needed to know. The cooling system was performing within its design parameters, the chassis balance was correct, and the tires were working. 17th was a number. It wasn't the number that mattered. Logan Pierce had qualified second, which was the number that Titan Racing had expected. The prototype's single-lap performance was remarkable. A machine built to extract every fraction of available performance from a purpose-built package, with a team behind it that had optimized the setup through 3 days of testing. The car was beautiful and fast in the way that serious money and serious engineering produce, which was the way Nathan knew better than most. The pole position belonged to a driver named Rafe Castellano, who ran for a European-backed privateer team out of Nevada and who had won this race twice before. Rafe was 38 and had the slightly weathered look of someone who had spent a great deal of time in open vehicles in conditions that were not gentle. Nathan had spoken to him briefly during registration, and Rafe had asked him about the cooling architecture in the way that a person asks about something they've genuinely noticed rather than as a conversational gesture. Nathan had told him enough to answer the question and stopped there. Rafe had nodded slowly. Desert racing is a cooling problem that happens to involve driving, he'd said, which was close enough to Nathan's own thinking that Nathan had looked at him for a moment longer than the exchange probably warranted. Yeah, Nathan said. That's about right. At the start line, Nathan sat in the car with the engine idling and watched the field ahead of him through the morning air, which was cold enough at this hour that his exhaust produced a visible vapor trail. The temperature at 6 a.m. was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The forecast for the canyon section, which they would reach in the early afternoon, was 111. He put his hands on the wheel and thought about systems. Not strategy, not competition, not Logan Pierce in the second row ahead of him, just the systems. The cooling loop, the brake temps, the fuel load, and how it would affect balance as it burned down through the first 100 miles. These were things he could control by thinking about them correctly. The rest would be what it would be. The starter raised the flag. The first 40 miles were exactly what the data had suggested they would be. On the paved valley section, the faster machines pulled away with the kind of authority that horsepower buys, and Nathan ran in his grid position, not fighting for more than the car would give, managing his systems and watching the temperature readouts and letting the race develop ahead of him the way a person watches weather move across a landscape they know well. Logan's Titan prototype was visible intermittently through the field, a silver shape at the front of the race, moving with the composed aggression of a car being driven at high but sustainable effort. Rafe Castellano was with him, the two of them separated by a gap that opened and closed depending on the corner sequence. Nathan concentrated on his own work. There was plenty of it. The car required constant input. It wasn't a machine that drove itself, not by any stretch. The suspension was stiffer than ideal for this surface because he'd compromised it deliberately in favor of heat dissipation in the mountain section, which meant the valley stage was going to punish him in his seat for 40 miles. He'd known that when he made the decision, and he still thought it was correct, and he still felt every impact through the harness. By mile 60, where the course transitioned to gravel, he had moved to 15th. Two cars ahead of him had made minor errors, one a blown tire, one a navigational mistake on a junction that cost the driver 3 minutes. Nathan hadn't done anything particularly exceptional. He'd just been there, running cleanly, when the opportunity to advance appeared. The gravel section changed the dynamics considerably. On loose surface, at speed, the finer points of chassis, balance, and driver sensitivity became more consequential than peak power, and Nathan found a rhythm there that he hadn't quite found on the pavement. The car communicated through the wheel with an honesty that reminded him why he'd built it the way he had, not for what it would tell people at an exhibition, but for what it would tell him when he needed the information. He passed a third car at mile 78 in a long right-hand bend where the competitor ahead braked too early and gave up a line that Nathan could use. He went through without drama. 12th, Marco Vega, the young driver from the adjacent paddock space, was running ahead of him somewhere. Nathan caught a glimpse of his car's livery, a bright orange that his father had painted in what Nathan suspected was their driveway, 3 positions ahead around mile 90. Marco was pushing harder than the car probably wanted to be pushed, the tail stepping out under braking, the corrections quick and athletic and just a fraction behind where they needed to be truly controlled. He was fast. He was also using the car in a way that had a cost that would show up later. Nathan filed that away and kept running. The temperature had reached 87 degrees by the time the field began the approach to the Carrizo Canyon entrance at mile 140. The course marshal station at the canyon entrance was staffed by 4 officials in orange vests, and beyond them the road narrowed visibly and the walls of the canyon closed in and the desert sky reduced itself to a corridor above. Nathan's engine temperature was sitting at exactly where he expected it to sit, not low. He wasn't running this system at low temperatures because low temperatures meant it wasn't being used, and a cooling system that wasn't being used wasn't proving anything. It was sitting at the high end of its optimal range, which was precisely where his design was supposed to hold it, and it was holding it with the stability of something that had been thought through rather than improvised. Up ahead, through the radio channel that carried event timing information, he caught the first indication that the race was beginning to change shape. A competitor, the entry number identified it as one of the well-funded privateer teams that had qualified 6th, had retired with overheating at mile 138. Mechanical retirement confirmed. Then, 7 minutes later, a second retirement. Different team, same cause. This was what he had calculated. Not hoped for. Calculated. He had the ambient temperature data from the past 8 years of this event, and he had the mechanical failure records from the same period, and the pattern was clear enough that calling it a surprise would have been dishonest. The canyon trapped heat differently than the open desert, and teams that set up their cooling for the valley conditions were under-equipped for what happened when the canyon walls closed in around them. Nathan's readout didn't flicker. He watched it the way he watched everything, without expectation, without relief, just as information. He was running ninth by the time he entered the canyon proper. The canyon stage was where the race became a different kind of problem. The road through Carrizo was wide enough for a single car in some places, and marginally wider in the sections where the wall had been carved back, and the surface was hard-packed earth over bedrock, which meant it was fast but unforgiving, the kind of surface that doesn't disguise errors the way loose gravel does. A mistake here didn't mean a slide and a recovery. A mistake here meant a wall, and the walls were not gentle. Nathan had driven this section twice in a road car before entering the event, taking notes on the corner sequences and the sight lines and the places where the road's apparent direction and its actual direction diverged. He had photographs, elevation profiles, and the notes of 2 drivers who had competed here previously and been willing to talk to him. He knew where the road was honest and where it lied. He gained 2 more positions in the first 8 miles of the canyon. Neither pass was dramatic. He chose his moments. A place where he knew the corner after the next was tighter than it looked, which meant the competitor ahead would brake earlier than he needed to, and Nathan's line didn't require that early brake. He went through clean both times. 7th, the radio channel carried another retirement. Engine-related, a team that had been running in the top 5. Then noise from the timing data. Rafe Castellano had slowed. Not retired, but slowed enough to be significant. The event coverage app on Nathan's co-driver display showed a gap to the leaders that had changed shape. He was running now in a different race than the one that had started 6 hours ago. Logan Pierce was aware that the field behind him was thinning. He could feel it in the way the radio chatter changed, and in the split times that came through his engineer's voice in his earpiece. What he didn't know, because he had no reason to be tracking a 17th-placed independent entry, was the specific position of the car with the mismatched body panels and the unusual cooling geometry. His engineer's name was Carver, and Carver was thorough and cautious, and had been with Titan Racing for 6 years and had worked with Logan long enough to know his rhythms. "Engine temps are climbing," Carver said through the earpiece. "I see them," Logan said. His own readouts were showing a number that wasn't alarming yet, but was moving in a direction he didn't like. "What's the delta from the valley section?" 11 degrees above our canyon projection. We didn't account for today's ambient fully. "Give me a management target." "Back off 4% throttle input on the canyon straights. You'll lose maybe 8 seconds per mile in this section." Logan said nothing for a moment. 8 seconds per mile in a race where the gaps at the front were measured in seconds was not a small ask. He looked at the road ahead of him and thought about the gap to Rafe, who had been matching him through the early canyon miles, and who had now apparently fallen back. "Who's behind me?" he asked. "Nearest competitor is Torrance, running P2. He's 40 seconds back." "What about further?" "You're clear, Logan. Run your pace." He didn't quite believe it, in the way that experienced competitors develop an instinct for the things the timing data doesn't show. But he backed off 4% on the straights and watched his engine temperature stabilize and told himself that 40 seconds was enough and concentrated on the road. By mile 206, Nathan was running 5th. He knew this not with satisfaction, but with the flat recognition of someone reading an instrument correctly. 5th meant that 4 cars were still ahead of him in a race that had started with 28. It meant that whatever was going to happen in the final 100 miles was going to happen at the front of the race, rather than somewhere in the middle of the field where errors are cheaper. Marco Vega had retired at mile 190, which Nathan had seen coming from the canyon entrance. The orange car had been working too hard for too long, and it had said what it had to say in the language of mechanical failure. He felt something about that. Not quite sympathy, because Marco was a stranger, but something close to recognition. He'd made different versions of that same choice himself years ago and paid different versions of that same price. The car that was now running fourth, directly ahead, was a semi-professional entry from Arizona that had been quiet and consistent all day. Its driver was named Sullivan, and Sullivan had the specific quality of being very difficult to pass because he was not making errors. He wasn't fast enough to be a front-runner, but he was steady enough to still be in the race while faster competitors weren't, and that was worth something. Nathan spent 12 miles behind Sullivan, not forcing anything, reading the lines the car ahead was taking and identifying the places where his chassis could do something Sullivan's chassis couldn't. The right rear of Sullivan's car was showing the beginning of tire wear in the way it loaded up through the longer right-handers, a slight trailing instability, not dangerous, but progressive. Nathan noted it and waited for the road to give him a section where Sullivan's tire would be honest about what it couldn't do. It came at mile 218, a downhill left-hand sweeper followed immediately by a sharp right. Sullivan set up wide for the left, and the worn rear broke traction for just a fraction more than he expected, the car yawing slightly, and by the time Sullivan had corrected and straightened, Nathan was already committed to the inside of the right. He cleared Sullivan clean. Fourth. The temperature was 108 degrees in the canyon. His engine coolant was running at 214, which was within the upper operating band of the system. The heat was real, and it was present, and his design was dealing with it exactly the way he'd calculated it would, which was not a surprise and was still, in some part of him that was separate from the engineering, something that he felt rather than merely registered. He thought about the Meridian Pavilion. Miranda Cole's assessment, it looks like a student project, delivered with the specific authority of someone who had enough experience to be confident in her surface-level judgments. He thought about the particular sound the group had made, the quickly suppressed sounds. He hadn't reacted to any of that in the moment, which had been a choice, but he was aware of it now the way you become aware of a sound in a room after the room goes quiet. The radio crackled. Event timing update. A retirement ahead. Logan's voice came into Nathan's awareness in the form of a car number on the timing display. Not retired, but flagged for a mandatory technical check at the canyon exit station at mile 240. Engine temperature warning. The marshals had the authority to hold a car for inspection if the onboard telemetry transmitted a fault code, and Titan Racing's prototype had apparently transmitted one. Nathan didn't react. He kept his hands where they were and his eyes where they needed to be, and ran the next mile the same way he'd run the previous 217. But something in the race had shifted, quietly and without announcement, the way the balance of things sometimes shifts when the conditions become honest enough to show what was actually there all along. He was running third. The canyon walls rose on either side, blocking the sky to a strip of white-blue overhead, and the heat pressed down through the opening, and the engine behind Nathan's seat ran clean and steady and true, and the road ahead curved toward the canyon exit where the desert would open back up and the final 72 miles would begin, and Nathan Cross pressed forward into all of it with his hands steady on the wheel and his mind in the systems and his face behind the visor telling nothing to anyone. The canyon exit came up fast, a widening of the walls, a sudden expansion of sky, and then the desert opening ahead like a held breath finally released. Nathan came through the Marshall station at mile 240 without slowing, his clearance confirmed by radio 30 seconds before he reached it, and the road flattened out and the horizon pulled back to where it belonged, and he let the engine breathe at full load for the first time in 40 miles. The mandatory technical hold had cost Logan Pierce 11 minutes. Nathan knew the number because event timing was public, and the display on his co-driver screen updated continuously, and 11 minutes was the kind of number that changed the shape of a race fundamentally. It didn't end Logan's day. The Titan prototype had cleared the inspection, the fault code had been a sensor warning rather than an actual system failure, and Logan had been released with a stern notation in the timing record and a coolant management protocol from Carver that he was apparently following because his pace had dropped and his temperatures had stabilized. But 11 minutes meant that the race Logan had been running, the one at the front of the field, separated from the competition by the authority of a superior machine, was no longer the race he was in. Nathan was running third, behind Rafe Castellano, who had recovered from his earlier slowing, and a driver named Ennis Park, who ran a well-funded private effort out of Nevada and who Nathan had not seriously considered a factor until the canyon had thinned the field enough to make him one. Park was competent and careful, and his car was genuinely quick on the desert straightaways that made up much of the remaining 72 miles. Nathan had been watching Park's lines through the final canyon sections and had identified two things. Park was good at managing his machinery, and Park had a tendency to slightly overbrake for corners where the surface changed from hard pack to loose gravel on entry. It wasn't an error exactly. It was just a preference that cost him a small fraction of time in specific places and created a small gap in those places that a different car might be able to use. Nathan filed it and kept running. But Rafe Castellano was aware of the car behind him, the way a good driver is always aware of the car behind him, as information rather than threat, a piece of data to be incorporated without distraction. He'd been watching Nathan split since the mid-canyon section with the genuine interest of someone who understood what those numbers meant in terms of what was happening under the hood of the machine producing them. That independent entry is running third, his co-driver said. A man named Tomas, who had been navigating desert races for 15 years and who communicated in the specific compressed language of someone accustomed to saying important things at speed. I know, Rafe said. His temps are clean, dead clean, in this heat. I know that too. Tomas was quiet for a moment. Then, who is he? Rafe didn't answer immediately because he was committing to a long right-hand bend that required his full attention, and also because the answer to that question was something he'd been thinking about since the registration desk, when he'd asked about the cooling architecture and gotten the kind of response that meant the person answering it had built the thing himself and understood it in a way that went deeper than documentation. Someone who knows what he's doing, Rafe said finally. The problem with running third with 70 miles remaining in a race where second and first were both held by drivers who also knew what they were doing was that the mathematics of the situation offered a limited number of solutions. Nathan worked through them the way he worked through engineering problems. Not with optimism, not with pessimism, just with the honest accounting of what was available. Ennis Park was 1 minute and 40 seconds ahead. The gap had been 2 minutes at the canyon exit and had come down because Nathan had found a rhythm on the desert surface that suited the chassis better than the canyon had, and because Park's overbraking tendency was costing him in the gravel sections. At current delta, Nathan would reach Park with approximately 30 miles remaining. That was workable, if nothing else changed. Rafe Castellano was 40 seconds ahead of Park. Rafe had 2 race victories here. He knew this road. His car was quick, and he was saving it intelligently, which meant the pace Nathan was seeing from him right now was not Rafe's maximum pace. It was Rafe managing to a finish while preserving the gap he had. Behind Nathan, Logan Pierce was running in what was now 4th position, 11 minutes back on corrected time, and the Titan prototype was moving again. Not at the pace it had shown before the hold, but faster than Nathan's current split. The cooling management protocol had given Logan a sustainable output, and Logan was using it, which meant the gap of 11 minutes was not a fixed number. Nathan ran the arithmetic and didn't like some of what it told him and noted what it told him anyway, and concentrated on the road. At mile 258, in a section of open hardpan where the track was marked by orange stakes rather than physical barriers, Nathan came up behind Ennis Park in the approach to a gentle left-hander that tightened unexpectedly at its apex. He had known about this corner from his reconnaissance. He had a photograph of it in his mental file, taken on a cold morning in February when he'd driven out here in his truck specifically to look at it, because the approach made it look like a standard sweeper, and it wasn't. Park braked at the place he always braked. A fraction early, a fraction more than necessary. The car settling back on its suspension with the compliance of a machine whose driver was prioritizing control over commitment. Nathan didn't brake early. He'd calculated the entry speed for this specific corner twice and then driven it twice in his road car to confirm the calculation, and he braked at the mark he'd set for himself from that preparation. The car pushed at the limit of adhesion through the middle of the bend. Not comfortable, not alarming, just at the place where the physics were honest, and he carried the speed through. He came out of the corner alongside Park, and they were matched for a moment, 2 machines side by side on the open desert, and then Nathan's exit speed told the story that the corner had been building toward, and he moved clear. He didn't look across at Park as he passed. There was nothing to see that the timing wouldn't tell him, and his eyes needed to be on what was coming next. Second, the calculation shifted. Rafe Castellano was 42 seconds ahead. The remaining distance was 61 miles. Nathan did the math quickly and did it again because the first answer seemed optimistic and the second answer confirmed the first. At current delta, he would reach Rafe with approximately 15 miles remaining. 15 miles was not much room, but 15 miles in a desert race at this stage, with this kind of heat still pressing down on every machine in the field, was also not nothing. He pushed the thought aside and concentrated on closing the gap. Logan Pierce's earpiece carried the timing update at mile 262, and Carver's voice had the specific flatness of a man delivering information he knows will land badly. "Cross just past Park. He's running second." Logan took 3 seconds to respond, which was not nothing in the context of driving at speed. "What's his gap to Rafe?" 40 seconds and closing. His pace is up 4/10 from his canyon average. Another pause. "What are his temps?" Carver hesitated. "Clean." Logan didn't say anything to that. He changed the brake bias 2 clicks and drove. He knew whose cooling system was in that car. He had known the moment he'd seen it at the Meridian Pavilion. The intake geometry, the duct routing, the specific shape of the arrangement that he'd looked at in an engineering presentation 4 years ago, and then looked at again when his patent attorney had filed the documentation with Logan's name on it. He'd known, and he'd managed the knowing, the way he managed most things that were inconvenient, by moving quickly to the next thing and not giving the previous thing space to grow. Seeing it working in the desert, in the heat, at 260 miles into a race that was destroying better-funded machinery. That was harder to manage. "Carver," he said. "Yeah. If I push the temps to the upper limit of the protocol, what do I gain?" Silence for 4 seconds. "Maybe 12 seconds per 10 miles. But you're already at the ceiling we set after the hold. If you push above that and the sensor wasn't lying about the system's stress, what's my gap to cross? 10 minutes? 40 seconds on corrected time." Logan worked the numbers. Even at 12 seconds per 10 miles, the math didn't recover the race. He knew that. He pushed the throttle anyway, not because it changed the arithmetic, but because sitting at managed pace while the car Nathan Cross had built with his hands in a shop in Flagstaff ran through the front of the Phoenix Desert Classic was a thing Logan Pierce found he could not simply experience without response. Rafe Castellano felt the gap closing behind him before Tomas confirmed it with numbers. He felt it in the way experienced competitors feel these things, through the accumulation of small timing signals, the corner markers arriving at intervals that told him the car behind was not running at the same pace it had been running 10 minutes ago. "He's taken 30 seconds out of us in the last 12 miles, Tomas said. "What's he running for temps?" "Not public, but he's not slowing." Rafe considered the road ahead. He had 15 miles of open desert before the race's final technical section, a series of elevation changes and off-camber corners where the road climbed briefly before dropping to the valley floor in the finish. He knew this section better than he knew most roads on Earth. He'd won here twice, partly because of what he knew about these last 15 miles. He pushed his pace up. Not dramatically. He wasn't going to manufacture drama where patience served better, but enough to make the question real. If the car behind him was going to take second place at this stage of this race, it was going to have to earn it against a driver who was genuinely trying to prevent it. The gap stabilized for 2 miles. Then it began closing again. "He's not backing off," Tomas said. "No," Rafe said. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded, if anything, like a man who had been wondering when this moment would arrive. Nathan found Rafe Castellano's bumper at mile 287, with 14 miles remaining. The gap had come down to nothing through a combination of Nathan's pace management, calculated, systematic, built on the knowledge that his car's thermal advantage would compound across distance in exactly this heat, and what Nathan recognized, with professional respect, as Rafe's decision to run honestly rather than conservatively once he knew he was being chased. They ran together through 4 miles of open desert. Nathan tried the inside at a left-hand junction at mile 291, and Rafe closed the door cleanly, not aggressively, just with the efficient line closure of a driver who knows how to defend without creating risk. Nathan took the information and filed it. The junction wasn't the right place. The right place was coming. He knew because he'd studied it. The elevation section beginning at mile 295 had two specific characteristics that made it different from the open desert. The surface became rougher, with embedded rock fragments that rewarded a car with stiffer suspension and penalized a car that was set up for compliance. And the road's fall line in the descent section at mile 298 created an entry angle into the final corner before the valley floor that only worked properly if you carried a specific speed over the crest. Too fast over the crest, and the car went light, and the entry angle was wrong. Too slow, and the apex was unreachable, and you lost exit speed onto the long flat that led to the finish. Nathan had a number for this crest. He'd calculated it from the elevation data and the suspension geometry of his own car specifically, and he'd verified it in the road car during his reconnaissance, and then revised the number slightly based on what the road actually did versus what the survey data said it did. He had the number, and he had confidence in the number, and he needed to get close enough to Rafe before the crest to make the corner differential matter. He got there at mile 294. One car length behind Rafe, both of them climbing now, the desert dropping away behind them and the sky expanding overhead, and the heat pressing straight down through the open tops of their machines. Rafe held his line on the climb, which was the correct line for his car and his setup. Nathan's line through the ascent was slightly different, tighter to the inside where the surface was rougher, but the geometry worked better for where he needed to be at the crest. He took the rough surface because his suspension was built for it, and Rafe's wasn't quite. And the differential was small, but it was real, and real was what he needed. They reached the crest at the same moment, and Rafe carried what Nathan knew was fractionally more speed than the descent angle wanted, because Rafe was reading the road the way he'd read it twice before, and the road had been slightly different both of those times in ways that mattered now. The Castellano car went light over the crest. Just a fraction. Just enough. And Rafe made the correction with the skill of someone who has made that correction 10,000 times, but the correction cost him the apex. Nathan went through on the inside. Committed, clean, the car doing exactly what the number he'd calculated said it would do, the rear loading up through the descent the way he'd modeled it, and settling the way he'd modeled it, and the exit speed onto the flat, telling him, in the unambiguous language of physics, that the corner had worked. He came out of the descent with a car-length lead, and the flat and the finish spread ahead of him and put his foot down. First. The thought arrived without ceremony, and he let it sit without ceremony, and kept his eyes on the road. He heard Logan Pierce before he saw him. The radio channel that carried event information also carried competitor communications when competitors chose to broadcast on the open frequency, which was rare but not prohibited. At mile 301, with 11 miles remaining, a voice came through that Nathan recognized the way you recognize a voice that has lived in your memory for 3 years, whether you wanted it to or not. Cross, the open frequency. Logan's voice carrying the flat, controlled affect of someone who has decided to say something and has prepared for it. Nice drive. Nathan didn't respond. He had nothing to say to Logan Pierce on an open radio channel 11 miles from a finish line with a lead he was not going to give back. He concentrated on the flat and ran his pace and let the silence be what it was. 30 seconds passed. Then Logan again. You know what you're running in that car doesn't change anything. The record is the record. Nathan's hands stayed where they were. His pace stayed where it was. The desert ran beneath him at the rate it was running, and the finish was where it was, and nothing Logan Pierce said on an open radio channel was going to alter any of those facts. He thought about responding. He thought about the specific words available to him, and what they would cost and what they would purchase. Then he thought about what the next 11 miles would say, stated plainly, without ambiguity, to anyone who cared to read the timing records. He decided to let the 11 miles do the talking, but something had shifted in him when he heard that voice. Not anger, not the kind of anger he'd felt in the first year after the termination when it had been hot and constant and exhausting to carry. This was something colder and more specific, a sharpening of focus that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with precision. He was going to finish this race, and he was going to finish it first, and he was going to do it in a car he had built with his own hands, using a system he had designed in his own mind. And the timing records would state that fact without editorializing and without apology, and that was the only response that was going to matter when the day was done. He pushed the pace up 2/10, not because he needed to, because he could. Behind him, in fourth position, Logan Pierce was running the Titan prototype at the upper limit of what Carver's cooling protocol allowed, and feeling the distance between himself and the front of the race as a specific kind of weight that had nothing to do with the car's physical mass. He had won races. He had run at the front of fields like this one. He understood what it felt like to be the person the race was about, and he understood with the clarity that comes from covering 300 miles of desert in one day that he was not that person today. The car ahead of him, 2 positions ahead, with a gap that corrected time was not going to close, was running on the engineering he had taken and reshaped and put his name on, and it was running in the desert heat at pace he could not match, in a machine that looked like nothing and was proving itself to be something that his $100 million prototype apparently was not. And there was nothing Logan could say on any radio frequency that was going to change what the record was going to say when this day ended. He knew that. He set it into his helmet where no one could hear it, just the words stripped of everything around them. He's going to win. And then he drove the remaining miles the way a professional drives when the race is not going the way the race was supposed to go, which is to say, cleanly and without surrender, and with the dignity that the machinery and the event deserved, even when the outcome didn't. Petan. The valley floor arrived as a long, flat sweep of hardpan, the finish line structure visible from 2 miles out. A simple gantry over the track, white and blue, with the timing equipment and the small cluster of officials and the handful of spectators and support crews who had driven out to the finish position. Beyond it, the desert ran to the horizon without apology. Nathan came off the final corner onto the approach and held the throttle where it was and let the car find its pace on the flat surface, and felt the finish line pulling toward him the way it pulls when you've earned it rather than simply arrived at it. 2 miles. The engine temperature was 217, within parameters. The tires had given everything they had, and there was nothing left in them but what was needed for 2 miles, and 2 miles was exactly what was needed. The chassis was talking to him through the wheel with the honest communication of something that had been used fully and completely and had not broken under the use. 1 mile. The gantry was clearly visible now, the timing lights, the officials moving into their positions. He thought about Earl Duchamp, who had rented him a shop with a broken compressor and drawers full of someone else's solutions and hadn't asked too many questions. He thought about Dennis Farr's voice on the phone, reading a patent number into the silence between them. He thought about the exhibition hall and the group moving away toward Bay 12 and the specific sound they'd made that he'd carried for 8 days without putting it down. He let those things go. Not dramatically. Just the way you put something down when you've carried it far enough and the place you were carrying it toward has arrived. 1/2 mile. The car was going to make it. He had known it was going to make it since the canyon, since the temperature held, since the engineering said what it said in the language of numbers rather than the language of ambition. He had known, and he had kept driving anyway, because knowing and proving are different things, and the difference is the whole point. The finish line came up, and he crossed it at speed and didn't lift until the runoff zone required it. And even then he lifted slowly, decelerating through the gears, feeling the car slow under him, feeling the race end in the way a race ends when it ends the way it was supposed to end. The radio crackled. An event official's voice, dry and professional, and carrying no particular weight of occasion. Car 47, you have the flag, time recorded, congratulations. Nathan sat in the car for a moment after it stopped rolling, his hands still on the wheel, the engine ticking down through its cooling cycle, the desert heat pressing through the carbon and aluminum and steel of the machine around him. The temperature outside was 112 degrees. The temperature inside his cooling system was 217 and falling. He reached up and pulled the helmet off, which took 2 tries because his hands were not entirely steady, and set it on the roll hoop, and sat in the car with the desert sun on his face and the finish line behind him and the field still coming in behind that. Rafe Castellano crossing 38 seconds later with the clean efficiency of a man who had run his race honestly, and Logan Pierce 4 minutes after that in 4th position, the Titan prototype's bodywork showing the dust and heat of 312 miles in a way that expensive cars always look slightly surprised to show. Nathan didn't watch Logan cross. He was looking at his own dashboard, the temperature readout, the fuel remaining, the sensor data still logging even now, building a record of what had happened today in the precise and unambiguous notation of telemetry. 214 and falling. 211. 208. The system cooling down correctly. The system that had always been his cooling down correctly in the desert after a race, the way he had always known it would. He sat with that for a while. The desert didn't offer any commentary, and he didn't need it to. The trophy presentation happened 40 minutes after the last finisher crossed the line, in the shade of the event's main hospitality structure. A large canvas canopy stretched over folding tables and a temporary stage that someone had assembled that morning with the pragmatic efficiency of people who do this every year and know exactly how long it takes. Nathan stood at the edge of the staging area in his driving suit, which was damp with sweat, and carrying the particular combination of dust and heat that 312 desert miles deposits on everything it touches, and watched the event coordinator work through the formalities of announcing the results to the assembled crews and officials and the handful of journalists who covered this race annually. He hadn't changed clothes, he hadn't had a team to hand him a clean shirt. What he had was Rafe Castellano standing beside him, which had happened naturally and without arrangement. Rafe had simply walked over from his own crew when the staging call went out and positioned himself next to Nathan with the ease of someone who had decided, somewhere in the final miles, that this was where he wanted to be. "Hell of a corner at the crest," Rafe said. He was looking at the stage, not at Nathan. "You made me work for it," Nathan said. "You'd done the homework." "I had time to do the homework." Rafe glanced at him. There was something in the look. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. More like the recognition of someone who has just understood something that was only partially visible before. He nodded once and looked back at the stage. The event coordinator announced the results in reverse order, which was standard, and Nathan listened to his own name arrive at the end of the sequence, with the detached quality of hearing something you've rehearsed long enough that the actual occurrence feels slightly unreal. There was applause from the people assembled. Genuine, if not extensive, the kind of applause that comes from a crowd that is responding to an unexpected result and hasn't fully decided what it means yet. He walked to the stage and collected the trophy, which was heavier than he'd expected and awkward to hold with one hand. The event coordinator shook his hand and said something congratulatory that Nathan registered without fully processing. And then there was a moment where Nathan stood on the stage with the trophy and the desert behind him and the assembled field in front of him. And he looked out at the faces, crews, officials, drivers, the people from the premium paddock section who had come down to the finish position in their air-conditioned vehicles. And he found Logan Pierce in the middle of the crowd. Logan was standing with two members of the Titan team. He was not applauding. He was not doing anything that could be described as a visible reaction. He was simply standing with his arms at his sides, watching, with the expression of a man who has decided that the most defensible position available to him is stillness. Nathan held the trophy and looked at Logan for 3 seconds. Not with anger, not with satisfaction in the way people imagine satisfaction in moments like this, with something more neutral than either. The simple act of letting the moment be what it was, unreinforced and undiminished. Then he looked back at the event coordinator and stepped off the stage. The press area at the Phoenix Desert Classic was a folding table with 6 chairs and a backdrop that had seen better decades set up behind the hospitality canopy. 3 journalists were waiting when Nathan arrived. A writer from an automotive publication, a blogger who covered desert racing independently, and whose site had a following. Nathan hadn't known about until someone had mentioned it in the paddock the day before, and a woman he didn't recognize who was sitting slightly apart from the other two with a recorder on the table in front of her and a notepad on her knee and the specific quality of attention that distinguishes someone who is at a press event to actually listen from someone who is there to confirm what they already believe. Her name was Claire Donovan. He found that out when the event coordinator introduced the press table, reading from a list. Claire Donovan, freelance investigative journalism, credentials confirmed. She was 40, approximately. Dark hair pulled back with the utilitarian efficiency of someone who regards that particular decision as settled. She looked at Nathan when his name was introduced with the direct, non-theatrical focus of someone who has been waiting to look at him specifically. The automotive writer asked the questions that automotive writers ask at these events, about the car, about the build process, about the cooling architecture, about what the independent entry experience had been like. about what came next. Nathan answered the factual questions and declined to speculate on the others, which was not a strategy so much as an accurate reflection of the fact that he had genuinely not thought beyond the race. The cooling system, the blogger said. There's been some discussion in the paddock about its relationship to Titan Racing's patented technology. Can you address that? Nathan looked at him. My system is my system. I designed it. The engineering record on my car speaks for itself. But the architecture is mine, Nathan said. Not with heat, with precision. I can explain exactly how it works and exactly when I developed it and exactly what differentiates it from what Titan Racing patented. I'm happy to do that with any technical reviewer who wants to go through the documentation. The blogger wrote something down. The automotive writer asked a follow-up about the race strategy. Nathan answered it. He was watching Claire Donovan in his peripheral vision because she hadn't asked anything yet, and she had the look of someone who was going to ask something that mattered. She waited until the other two were finishing their notes. Then she said, Mr. Cross, I've been researching the original development history of the thermal management system that Titan Racing currently holds a patent on. I have documentation from the engineering department at the time of the original development. I have communication records. I have a timeline that does not match the timeline in Logan Pierce's patent filing. The folding table went quiet in the way that tables go quiet when the air around them changes. Nathan looked at her. What's your question? I don't have one yet, Claire said. I'm going to publish what I have. I wanted you to know before I did. He was quiet for a moment, not processing the information. He knew what the information was, he'd lived it, but calibrating something about the moment itself, about what it meant that a stranger had spent time he didn't know about, assembling a record he'd spent 3 years carrying alone. When? He said. Tomorrow morning. I've given Titan Racing 48 hours for comment. Their communication team declined. Nathan nodded slowly. He looked at the recorder on the table. Is that running? Yes. Then for the record, he said, everything you found is accurate. I designed that system. I have the original development documentation. I have time-stamped files that predate the patent filing by 14 months. He stopped. That's all I'll say on record right now. Claire looked at him with the same direct attention she'd been carrying since the introduction. That's enough, she said. She closed her notepad. For what it's worth, nice race. Nathan looked at her for a second. Thank you, he said, and meant it for both things simultaneously. The story went online at 6:47 the following morning, which Nathan knew because he was awake at that time. He had not slept especially well for the second consecutive night, though for different reasons than the night before the race, and he had his phone in his hand when the notification came through from the automotive publication that had picked up Claire's piece for republication alongside their own coverage of the race result. He read it in the cab of his truck in the paddock, which he was still occupying because breaking down the trailer in the dark the previous evening had felt like more than he had available, and so he'd slept there a second night and told himself he'd handle the departure in the morning. The piece was meticulous. That was the word that kept arriving as he read it. Claire Donovan had done the work that the kind of journalist you don't often encounter does. She had the original engineering meeting records from 4 years ago, obtained through sources she declined to name, but which Nathan suspected, based on the specificity of certain details, included at least one person he recognized. She had the time-stamp discrepancy between the earliest dated design documents in Titan Racing's patent filing and the actual date of Nathan's presentation to the engineering leadership. She had email records showing Logan Pierce's name on distribution lists for Nathan's internal technical summaries 14 months before the patent application listed him as the primary inventor. She had not editorialized. The piece presented the timeline and the documentation and let the gap between them speak without assistance. By 9 in the morning, it had been picked up by 3 additional publications. By noon, it was on the wire services. Nathan knew this because his phone, which had been quiet for 3 years, began producing sounds it didn't usually produce, and most of those sounds turned out to be journalists, and a few of them turned out to be people he'd worked with once and hadn't spoken to since. Dennis Farr called at 12:43. Nathan saw the number and sat with the phone in his hand for a moment before answering. Dennis? Nathan. A pause. Long enough that Nathan could hear background noise, An office, distant keyboard sounds. Dennis's voice had the particular quality of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say and has decided at the moment of saying it that the rehearsed version isn't adequate. I should have... He stopped, started again. I should have done more when it happened. You called me, Nathan said. You didn't have to do that. It wasn't enough. No, Nathan said. It wasn't. He let that sit for a beat. But you called. I didn't forget that. The silence between them had a different quality after that. Not comfortable exactly, but honest, which was its own thing. I talked to Claire Donovan, Dennis said. 3 weeks ago. I'm one of her sources. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. I figured it was probably you. I still work there. I don't know how long that's going to be true after today. I'm sorry about that. Don't be, Dennis said, and he sounded like he meant it, though also like he was still in the process of meaning it. It was past time. It was past time 4 years ago. They talked for another 10 minutes about things that were not the patent and not the race, about Dennis's family, briefly, about the shop on Route 9, about nothing in particular. The conversation of people who have been out of contact long enough that the resumption requires a warm-up period before anything real can be said. When they hung up, Nathan sat in the truck for a while and looked at the desert through the windshield. Miranda Cole called at 2 in the afternoon. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered it anyway, which he'd been doing all morning because the alternative was not answering his phone at all, and there were people calling whom he actually wanted to talk to. Mr. Cross. Her voice was the same as it had been at the Meridian Pavilion, the same authority, the same absence of conversational padding. What was different was the register beneath it, something that in a less controlled person would have been audible discomfort. In Miranda, it was more like a slight adjustment of weight. I imagine you've seen what's been published this morning. Yes, Nathan said. I want to say, for the record, if you choose to use that I did not have knowledge of the circumstances under which the patent was filed. I want to be precise about that because I think precision matters here. Nathan waited. I also want to acknowledge, Miranda continued, that not having knowledge is not the same as not being responsible. I ran the organization. The decisions made inside it, whether I approved them directly or not, were made by people I chose and trusted. That is a fact I'm sitting with today. It was, Nathan thought, a more honest statement than he'd expected from the person who had stood in his exhibition bay and called his car a student project. He didn't say that. What happens with Logan Pierce, he asked. A beat. He tendered his resignation this morning, before I had the opportunity to ask for it. Nathan nodded to himself. That also tracked. Logan would have made that calculation before anyone made it for him. A resignation was a form of control. It kept the narrative in a particular shape. That's not consequence, Nathan said. That's logistics. No, Miranda agreed. It isn't. The board is reviewing the patent filing. Our legal team is in contact with the Intellectual Property Office. I can't tell you what the outcome of that will be because I don't know, and I'm not going to speculate. I'm not asking you to. Another pause. Miranda's pauses had the quality of being purposeful rather than empty. You drove an extraordinary race yesterday. Thank you. The car is extraordinary. The system in it is extraordinary. She stopped. The weight shifted again. I should have known that at the exhibition. I should have looked more carefully. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He thought about the 4 seconds he'd held Logan Pierce's gaze from the stage. He thought about what he'd said to the recorder on Claire Donovan's table. Everything you found is accurate. And the way saying it plainly, on record, had felt like setting something down after a long carry. You're looking at it now, he said. That's what matters. It was not forgiveness. He wasn't sure he had forgiveness available, or that forgiveness was the right framework for what had happened between the organization Miranda ran and the work Nathan had done. But it was an accurate statement about the present tense, which was more useful than most of the alternatives. Miranda took it for what it was. I'd like to meet, she said. Not today. When you've had time to... She paused again. When the immediate noise has settled. All right, Nathan said. After the call ended, he sat with the phone in his lap and looked at the paddock around him. Most of the teams had broken down and left. The Titan racing transporter had gone sometime that morning. He'd heard the diesel rumble of it departing without looking up. The folding table and press backdrop were being disassembled by two event staff members who were working through it with the efficient indifference of people who assemble and disassemble things for a living and have no particular feelings about what happened at the table between assembly and disassembly. Garrett, the lead inspector from Technical, walked past the truck and lifted a hand in acknowledgement. Nathan lifted his back. He broke down the trailer himself, which took 2 hours, because everything about the setup and teardown of a one-man operation takes exactly as long as it takes, and there is no shortcutting any of it. He loaded the car with the care he always used, because the car deserved it, and because careful loading was a habit built over enough years that it operated independently of mood or circumstance. The tarp came down. The tool cases went in. The spare components, most of them unused because the car hadn't needed them, went back in their designated positions in the storage boxes along the trailer wall. He checked the tie-downs 3 times, which was 1 time more than he normally would have, and he wasn't entirely sure why, except that the day had the quality of a day in which checking things twice isn't sufficient. Rafe Castellano appeared while Nathan was running the final strap. He wasn't alone. Tomas was with him, carrying a cooler with the ease of someone carrying a cooler that has beer in it, which turned out to be accurate. Rafe set 2 bottles on the trailer fender without asking whether Nathan wanted one, which Nathan appreciated more than the asking would have permitted him to show. They stood at the trailer with the desert going orange around them in the late afternoon light, and drank the beer and didn't say much for a while, which was fine because the beer was cold and the silence was the comfortable kind. "What happens to the car?" Rafe asked eventually. "Goes back to the shop," Nathan said. "Route 9. You going to race it again?" Nathan looked at the car in the trailer. The mismatched panels, the welds he hadn't bothered to pretty up because they were structurally sound, and structural soundness was what mattered. The cooling ducts that sat in the same geometry he'd originally placed them in, 4 years ago, in a different building with a different title on his badge. "I don't know yet," he said, which was true. He had $5 million coming from the race purse and a phone full of messages from people who hadn't spoken to him in 3 years, and a story in 4 publications that had his name in it, in a way that was different from how his name had appeared in anything in a long time. He had a meeting with Miranda Cole pending, and a legal situation in motion, and a shop on Route 9 that would need to be open tomorrow morning because people in Flagstaff still needed their oil changed and their brakes checked and their wheel bearings replaced. Claire Donovan's piece, Rafe said. He said it without preamble, the way Tomas called corners. Information delivered at the moment it was relevant. "Yeah. I read it this morning." Rafe turned his bottle in his hand. "I've been in this circuit long enough to have heard things over the years. Things that didn't quite add up when you looked at them straight." He paused. "I'm sorry it took this long for the record to say the right thing." Nathan nodded. He didn't have an answer to that wasn't either too large or too small for the moment. He drank his beer and let the statement stand on its own. "For what it's worth," Tomas said, from slightly behind Rafe's left shoulder, in the specific tone of someone who has been listening patiently and has decided one thing needs adding, "the driving was clean, all the way through. Watching your lines in the canyon, that was somebody who'd done their work." Nathan looked at him. Tomas had the look of a man in his mid-50s who had spent those years watching races from the passenger seat and had developed, through that specific experience, a very accurate eye for the difference between what appeared to be happening and what was actually happening. "Thank you," Nathan said. They finished the beers as the light went from orange to the first stages of desert dark, and then Rafe shook Nathan's hand with the straightforward firmness of someone for whom a handshake is a sentence rather than punctuation, and he and Tomas walked back toward their own rig, and Nathan stood at the trailer alone with the empty bottle and the darkening sky and the car loaded and ready for the road. He got in the truck and sat for a moment with the engine off. The paddock was nearly empty. The gantry structure at the finish line was still standing, lit from below by the safety lighting the event kept on through the night, before the full breakdown crew arrived in the morning. The white and blue of it caught the last light in a way that was vivid and slightly unreal. He started the engine. The truck settled into its idle, and the trailer responded with the small sounds of its loaded weight, acknowledging that motion was being requested. He pulled out of the paddock space and onto the access road, and the gantry passed behind him as he turned toward the highway. And he didn't look at it in the mirror because the race was done, and the road ahead was the thing that required his attention now. The highway was quiet at this hour. A Tuesday evening in the desert, the sun gone, and the heat beginning to release itself from the asphalt in the way the desert heat releases, slowly and incompletely, leaving the night warm in a way that a person from elsewhere would still call hot. Nathan set the cruise control and drove north toward Flagstaff with the window cracked and the radio off and the trailer steady behind him. His phone was in the cup holder. It had been making sounds all day that he hadn't answered, and some of those sounds were from people he would eventually need to call back, and some of them were from people he didn't know a call back to, and the work of sorting that out was going to take more than one evening. He had a legal situation that was going to require an attorney, which meant he was going to need to find an attorney he could afford, which was a different calculation than it had been this morning, given the purse. He had a meeting with Miranda Cole that he hadn't agreed to because he trusted Miranda Cole, but because the conversation needed to happen, and some conversations need to happen regardless of trust. He had a shop on Route 9 with a car in it that he'd spent 18 months building. He had the cooling system he'd carried in his head since the conference room where Logan Pierce had been sitting 4 years ago, the day Nathan had shown the engineering leadership what he'd built, the last day he'd been inside that building as a member of the team. He had the race result, which was in the timing records now, immutable the way timing records are immutable, stating what it stated in the precise and unambiguous notation of elapsed time and position. Car 47, Nathan Cross, first place, Phoenix Desert Classic. The highway ran north and the desert ran alongside it, and the truck ran steady and the trailer ran steady, and Nathan Cross drove home through the dark with both hands on the wheel. He got back to Flagstaff at 11:43 at night and pulled the trailer around the back of the shop and unhitched it in the dark without turning on the overhead lights, because the overhead lights had a ballast that hummed at a frequency that had been bothering him for 2 months, and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. And tonight was not the night he was going to start. He worked by the light from the truck's cab and the ambient glow of the highway 1/4 mile down the road, and he got the trailer secured and the truck parked, and then he went inside and stood in the middle of the shop floor with his jacket still on and looked at the space around him. The shop smelled the way it always smelled, oil and metal and the particular dusty warmth of a building that holds heat from the day and releases it slowly through the night. The lift was in the down position. The tool drawers were where he'd left them. The partition he'd built between the front half and the build space in the back was exactly where it had always been, the corrugated sheet metal dull in the low light. He went to the back. The build space was empty now, in the way a space is empty when the thing that occupied it has been removed. Not just vacant, but shaped by the absence of what had been there. He stood in it for a while. Then he went to the small desk in the corner where he kept the paper documentation, the original design notes, the iteration logs, the hand-drawn schematics from the early stages of the build when he'd been working out the architecture before committing it to the computer. He opened the top drawer and looked at the folders inside. All of it still there. All of it dated. All of it in his handwriting, which was not particularly neat but was consistently his. He closed the drawer and went to find something to eat. What? The attorney's name was Sandra Okafor, and she operated out of a second-floor office in downtown Flagstaff above a dry cleaning business, and she had been recommended to Nathan by the automotive publication journalist who had called the day after the race, who had covered enough intellectual property disputes in the motorsport world to know which attorneys in the Southwest were worth the drive. Sandra was 47, direct in the way of someone who charges by the hour and respects her clients enough not to waste it. She had read Claire Donovan's article before Nathan arrived for the first meeting, and she had pulled the Titan Racing patent filing, and she had the two documents side by side on her desk when Nathan sat down across from her. "Walk me through the original development," she said. "Start with the first date you can document and don't leave anything out." Nathan walked her through it. He'd brought the folders from the desk drawer, which he placed on her desk in chronological order. Sandra went through them methodically, making notes, occasionally asking a question that cut to the specific technical or legal point she needed clarified. She didn't ask questions that were irrelevant, and she didn't offer opinions that weren't requested. Nathan found her efficient in a way that felt like respect rather than curtness. After 90 minutes, she set her pen down. "The timestamp discrepancy is significant," she said. "The documentation you have predates the filing by 14 months in the core architecture claims. Combined with the internal communication records that Donovan published, which I assume you can independently corroborate? Yes. Then this is a viable challenge. She paused. I want to be precise about what that means. Viable means the evidence supports the claim. It does not mean fast. It does not mean certain. Intellectual property litigation is long and expensive, and the outcome depends on factors neither of us can fully predict. I understand that. Titan Racing has considerably more resources for this kind of fight than you do. I have $5 million, Nathan said. I didn't have that 2 weeks ago. Sandra looked at him with the specific expression of an attorney recalibrating a situation. That changes the equation somewhat, she said. Not entirely, but somewhat. What's the first step? Filing a derivation proceeding with the Patent Office, Sandra said. That establishes the formal challenge on the record. Simultaneously, we send a preservation demand to Titan Racing for all internal communications and development documents related to the filing. Their response to that demand will tell us something about how they intend to fight this. She paused. Or whether they intend to fight it at all. Nathan looked at her. You think they might not? Logan Pierce has resigned. The story is public. Miranda Cole made a statement acknowledging institutional responsibility, which their communications team almost certainly drafted carefully, but which is still on the record. Sandra folded her hands. Companies in that position sometimes decide that the cost of fighting is higher than the cost of acknowledging, especially when the documentation is as clear as this. Nathan nodded slowly. He looked at the folders on her desk, the years of work contained in paper that had lived in a drawer in a repair shop, and thought about what it meant for them to be sitting in a lawyer's office instead. Do what needs doing, he said. Keep me informed. Sandra picked up her pen. I will, she said, and wrote something at the top of her notepad, and that was the beginning of the formal record that would eventually matter in ways neither of them could entirely predict from that chair on that afternoon. The money arrived in the stages, the initial purse payment, then the performance bonuses tied to the race result, then a secondary payment from the event's broadcast partner that Nathan hadn't known existed until Sandra mentioned it while reviewing the race contract. He sat with the numbers in his checking account and felt, for the first 3 days, slightly outside his own life. The way a person feels when something they planned for abstractly becomes concrete, and the concrete version doesn't quite match the shape of the planning. He replaced the ballast in the overhead light. The humming stopped. He called Earl Duchamp, his landlord, and told him he intended to stay through the end of his lease and probably beyond that. Earl said that was fine with him, in the tone of a man who had never expected otherwise. Nathan also told him he was thinking about expanding into the vacant bay next door, which had been unused since Earl had closed the business down. And Earl was quiet for a moment and then said he supposed they could talk about that. They talked about it the following Thursday over coffee at the diner 2 miles down the highway. That was the kind of diner that has been in the same building since before the highway was rerouted, and that has never seen any reason to change the menu significantly. Earl took his coffee with enough sugar that Nathan had stopped noticing it, and he listened while Nathan described what he had in mind with the expression of someone who is genuinely interested rather than performing interest. Workshop space, Nathan said. Not for my own work, for other people's. Earl turned his cup. What kind of people? Engineers, designers, people who have something they're developing and don't have access to facilities. Nathan paused, organizing the thought into words that were accurate rather than just serviceable. There are people doing genuinely good work who can't get it to the stage where it can be evaluated properly, because the gap between an idea and a prototype requires equipment and space and time that they don't have access to unless they have institutional backing, and institutions have conditions attached. Earl looked at him for a long moment. You're talking about yourself 4 years ago. I'm talking about a lot of people, Nathan said. I happen to know what that particular problem feels like from the inside. Earl drank his coffee. The bay next door needs a new roof section over the east wall. Been leaking since February. I know. I've seen the stain on the floor when it rains. You'd be taking that on. Yes. Earl set his cup down. Lease terms same as yours? If that works for you. Earl thought about it for the amount of time a man thinks about something when he's already decided but wants to make sure the decision is examined before it's confirmed. Then he said, all right, and they shook hands, and Nathan drove back to the shop and started making a list of what the expansion would require, which turned out to be a considerable list, but a manageable one if approached in the right order. Claire Donovan called on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after the race, while Nathan was under a car doing a brake job. He heard the phone from the floor and let it go to voicemail, and called her back when he was out from under. "The derivation filing made the trade press," she said when he answered. "You knew it would." Sandra mentioned it was possible. Titan's communications team put out a statement. They're characterizing it as a routine legal matter and expressing confidence in their documentation. A brief pause. "For what that's worth?" "Not much," Nathan said. "No." She paused again, differently this time. The pause of someone who has said the thing they called to say and is deciding whether to say the next thing. "I wanted to ask you something. Off the record, if you prefer." "Go ahead." "When I was doing the research, going through the documents, building the timeline, I kept thinking about how long it had been sitting there. The gap in the dates, the paper trail. It wasn't hidden exactly. It was just no one had looked." She stopped. "Did you ever try to raise it formally? After the termination?" Nathan leaned against the workbench. Through the shop door, he could see the highway in the thin November light, semi-passing north toward the interstate. "I raised it with a lawyer at the time, Monsieur," he said. "The settlement I signed had a non-disparagement clause. The attorney I could afford told me that fighting it would cost more than I had and take longer than I could sustain, and that the outcome was uncertain." "So you let it go?" "I signed the document," Nathan said. "That's different from letting it go." Claire was quiet for a moment. "The distinction matters," she said. "Yes," Nathan said. "It does." After the call, he stood at the workbench for a while without picking anything up. The distinction mattered. He'd thought about it often enough in the intervening years. The difference between accepting a condition and accepting its legitimacy. He had signed a document because the alternative was a fight he couldn't win at that moment, with the resources he had at that moment. Signing it had not meant he agreed with what had happened. It had meant he was making a tactical decision about time. 3 years in a repair shop on Route 9, 18 months building a car from salvage, 312 miles of desert. That was what he'd done with the time. Miranda Cole drove herself to the meeting, which Nathan had not expected. He had expected a car service or a driver, or at minimum someone from her communications team carrying a bag. What he got was a late-model sedan pulling into the gravel apron of the shop on a Thursday afternoon, and Miranda stepping out of it alone in a dark coat and shoes that were inappropriate for gravel, and picking her way across the apron with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided to do something outside their normal context and is doing it anyway. Nathan met her at the door. She looked at the shop the way she'd looked at the car at the Meridian Pavilion, with genuine assessment rather than courtesy. Her eyes moved from the lift to the tool drawers to the partition at the back and then to the bay next door, where the new roof section was still in progress, the framing visible through the open wall. "Expanding," she said. Slowly. He made coffee on the propane unit, which was the only coffee available, and Miranda accepted a cup without comment on its provenance. They sat on 2 shop stools near the workbench because there wasn't anywhere else to sit, and Nathan hadn't thought to bring chairs in from the office. Miranda held the cup in both hands. For the first time in the 3 interactions Nathan had had with her, she looked like someone who hadn't entirely prepared what she was going to say. It didn't look comfortable on her, which made it look more honest than anything else he'd seen from her. "The board has reviewed the patent situation," she said. "Our legal position is not what we were initially told it was. The documentation we have, the documentation Logan Pierce represented as original, has gaps that our attorneys are not able to explain in ways that are favorable to us." "I know," Nathan said. "Sandra Okafor is very thorough." Something moved briefly across Miranda's expression. Not quite humor. Something adjacent to it. "Yes, we've noticed." She drank the coffee. "We're not going to contest the derivation proceeding. I want you to know that directly rather than through the filing." Nathan looked at her. "Why?" "Because contesting it would require us to argue something we know isn't true," Miranda said. "I've run this organization for 19 years. I've made decisions I regret. I've made decisions that turned out to be wrong for reasons I couldn't have predicted. What I haven't done, what I am not willing to do, is stand in front of a legal proceeding and argue for something I know is false. She set the cup on the workbench. It would be the wrong call, and I'm tired of wrong calls. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. The highway outside sent the occasional sound through the shop wall. A truck, a distant horn, the ordinary noise of Route 9 going about its business. "The proposal you mentioned on the phone, say," he said. Miranda straightened slightly, back on prepared ground. "The technology you've developed, the version in the Phoenix car, is beyond what we patented. I've had 3 of our senior engineers review your telemetry data from the race, with your permission as filed with the event, and their assessment is that what you've built is a significant advancement over the architecture in the original filing." She paused. "I want to develop it, not acquire it, not license it. Develop it as a joint effort with ownership structure that reflects the actual origin of the work." "Define the ownership structure," Nathan said. 60% to you, 40 to Titan Racing, contingent on our engineering contribution to the development phase. All public documentation credits the technology to Nathan Cross as originating inventor. No ambiguity, no corporate language that obscures the individual contribution. She met his eyes. "I want it in the record correctly this time. That matters to me, separate from the legal situation." Nathan turned his cup in his hand. He thought about what Sandra had said. Companies sometimes decide the cost of fighting is higher than the cost of acknowledging. And he thought about what Miranda had just said, which was something more than acknowledgement, though he wasn't entirely sure yet what the more was. He thought about the woman at the exhibition who had called his car a student project, and the group that had made those sounds, and the 4 years between that version of himself and the person sitting on a shop stool in Flagstaff having this conversation. "There are conditions, West," he said. "I expected there would be." "The workshop next door," Nathan said. "The expansion I'm building, that stays independent, completely independent. Whatever arrangement we reach for the technology development doesn't touch what I'm building here." "Agreed. Any engineer who contributes to the development work gets credited by name in the documentation, not Titan Racing Engineering Team. By name." Miranda nodded slowly. "That's a cultural change for us. I'll make it happen. If I determine at any point that the development is being directed in a way that compromises the integrity of the engineering, not the business decisions, the engineering, I retain the right to withdraw." Nathan paused. "Not for money reasons. For accuracy reasons. If the work is being shaped to say something it doesn't actually say, I'm out." Miranda looked at him for a long moment. The shop was quiet around them except for the highway and the thin wind coming through the gap in the bay next door. She had the expression of someone encountering a set of terms they hadn't anticipated and finding, with some surprise, that the terms are reasonable. "Yes," she said, "all of that is acceptable." "Then we can have Sandra and your attorneys draw something up," Nathan said, "and I'll read it carefully." "I would expect nothing less," Miranda said, and this time the thing adjacent to humor had a little more room. The legal proceedings around the patent took 8 months, which was faster than Sandra had projected and slower than Nathan would have preferred, and ended with a formal reattribution that the trade press covered in 2 paragraphs and which Nathan read on his phone while sitting on the roof of the shop next door, where he was helping seal the new section with a bucket of roofing compound and a brush, because the contractor he'd hired had sent 1 person instead of 2, and Nathan had decided it was easier to help than to wait. The reattribution stated, in the specific dry language of intellectual property documentation, that the originating inventor of the thermal management architecture covered under the relevant patent was Nathan Cross, and that the patent was being reissued accordingly. It did not say anything about Logan Pierce by name, because legal documents often achieve their purposes through what they exclude rather than what they include. But the record of the original filing and the record of the reattribution, placed side by side, said everything that needed saying to anyone who cared to read them. Nathan read the 2 paragraphs twice and then put his phone in his pocket and picked up the brush and went back to sealing the roof. The workshop opened in the spring, in the bay that Earl had agreed to rent him. Nathan had spent 4 months on it. The roof first, then the electrical, then the equipment, sourced from the same kind of auction circuits he'd used for the Phoenix build. The same patience applied to the same problem of making limited resources accomplish things they weren't supposed to be able to accomplish. He'd put a notice in 3 engineering forums and sent letters to 2 university engineering departments and called a contact at a fabrication school in Tucson whom he'd met at the Phoenix paddock. The notice was brief. It said there was workshop space available for independent engineers working on original projects who lacked access to professional facilities, that the arrangement was designed to be accessible to people without corporate backing, and that inquiries should be directed to a specific email address. The first person to show up was a woman named Priya Mehta, 26 years old, finishing a master's thesis on variable geometry suspension systems, who drove 4 hours from Albuquerque with her laptop and a box of printed reference materials and a slightly stunned expression when she walked into the shop and saw the equipment. She asked Nathan 3 technical questions in the first 10 minutes, each one more specific than the last, and he answered all 3 in detail, and by the end of the 3rd answer they were standing at the workbench with 2 different sets of notes open between them, arguing about a damper rate calculation in the specific focused way of 2 people who have both thought about the same problem and arrived at different places. It was, Nathan thought, the most alive he'd felt in a shop since before Titan Racing. The second person came the following week. The 3rd and 4th came together, a pair of engineers from Phoenix who were developing an aerodynamic component they believed had applications in both racing and commercial transport, and who had been turned down by 2 corporate partners before finding Nathan's notice. They were cautious when they arrived, in the way that people are cautious when they've been turned down before. Nathan showed them the space and the equipment and asked them about the project, not with the evaluative condescension of a gatekeeper, but with the direct interest of an engineer who wanted to understand what they were doing. By the time they left that afternoon, they had a date for the following Monday and a shared understanding that the space was available for actual work rather than performance. Dennis Farr visited on a Saturday in June. He'd given 2 weeks' notice at Titan Racing the morning after Claire Donovan's article published, which turned out to be ahead of a workforce restructuring that was announced 3 weeks later and that would have made the decision for him in a less dignified way. He was freelancing now. Consulting work, some teaching at a community college engineering program, the careful reconstruction of a professional life that had been built inside one organization for 11 years and needed to be rebuilt outside of it. He arrived in the morning, and Nathan made the bad coffee, and they sat on the stools like Nathan and Miranda had sat, and the conversation was easier than the phone call had been, which Nathan had expected. The phone call had been the hard one, the one where the weight of the years between them had to be acknowledged before anything else could happen. The visit was the one after that. Dennis looked at the workshop next door through the connecting door Nathan had cut between the bays. Priya was in there working on her suspension rig, which she had partially assembled over the previous 3 weeks. Dennis looked at it with the specific, focused attention of an engineer encountering someone else's work. "How's the damper rate problem?" he asked, and Nathan looked at him. "You read the forum thread." "I follow the forum," Dennis said. "I followed it before I knew it was your workshop." He paused. "The argument she's making about the variable geometry interface. She's right. The calculation that's being challenged by the other commenter is wrong." "I know," Nathan said. "I told her that last Tuesday." Dennis smiled, which was the first time Nathan had seen him smile in 4 years, because the last time had been in person, before everything. "You need any help in here?" Dennis asked. Not with career urgency, not with the slightly desperate quality of someone looking for the next thing, with the genuine curiosity of someone who has found something interesting and wants to be closer to it. Nathan looked at him for a moment. "On a consulting basis," he said, "I can't offer you a salary yet. The workshop isn't at that stage." "I'm not asking for a salary," Dennis said. "I'm asking if you need help." "Yes," Nathan said, "I need help." Dennis nodded. He picked up his coffee cup and looked through the doorway at Priya's suspension rig. "I'll need to understand the project terms, the attribution structure." "Everyone who contributes gets credited," Nathan said, "by name, on the documentation. That's not negotiable, and it's not something I'll ever compromise on." Dennis looked at him. Something settled in his expression. Not relief exactly, but the release of something that had been held for a long time under pressure. "That's the only way it should work," he said. "Yes," Nathan said. "It is." Eek. The Titan Racing Joint Development Project produced its first testable prototype 14 months after Nathan and Miranda had signed the agreement in Sandra Okafor's second-floor office. The testing happened at a facility outside Phoenix on a Tuesday in October, with a small team present, 4 Titan engineers, Nathan, Sandra, observing for the documentation record, and Miranda, who had driven herself again and wore the same inappropriate for the conditions shoes, and who stood at the edge of the timing pad with her arms crossed, watching the prototype run through its thermal cycles with the focused attention of someone who has staked something on the outcome. The numbers were what the engineering said they would be. Not better than predicted, and not worse. Just accurate, the way things are when they've been developed honestly. Miranda looked at the readout and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "It works." "Yes," Nathan said. "I want to take it to the sanctioning body for the next series homologation window," she said, "if the performance parameters hold in field conditions." "They'll hold," Nathan said. Not with the defensive certainty of someone who needed to be believed, with the flat confidence of someone who had already run 312 desert miles on the engineering and knew what it did in conditions that were not gentle. Miranda looked at him. In the year and a half since the shop on Route 9, she had looked at him differently than she had in the Meridian Pavilion, and he'd noticed the difference without making anything of it, because the change was what it was, and what it was didn't require commentary. She was a person who had made a mistake of a specific kind, the kind where you trust surface presentation over substantive evaluation, and she had found out she'd made it and had decided to do something about it, and people who do something about it earn the difference in how they're regarded without needing to have the difference named. "The documentation," she said, "the public-facing credit on the homologation application." "Nathan Cross, originating inventor," Nathan said, "as specified." "As specified," Miranda confirmed. "I'll have the filing team confirm the language before submission." She paused. "You'll review it before it goes?" "Yes." She nodded, and that was the business of the moment concluded, and they stood together at the edge of the timing pad while the test team ran the next cycle, and the October sun came down clean and direct on the asphalt, and the numbers continued to be what the engineering said they would be. There is a particular kind of reckoning that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with the drama that wrong people imagine when they imagine vindication. The public moment, the reversal, the person who took from you standing in the corrected record forced to account for what they did in front of everyone who matters. Those moments exist sometimes. The patent reattribution was something close to one. But what Nathan Cross had actually learned across the years between a conference room presentation and a repair shop and a desert race, and a building with a new roof and a variable geometry suspension rig assembled by a 26-year-old engineer from Albuquerque, was that reckoning mostly feels like work. It feels like the thing you do next, and then the thing after that, with enough precision to let the record correct itself over time. The drama is mostly in your own head. The real thing is mostly incremental and imperfect, and requires more patience than anger, because anger burns fast and patience is the one that actually gets you somewhere. He had not emerged from the experience clean. He carried things that hadn't resolved. The years of the settlement clause, the specific face Logan Pierce had made at the Meridian Pavilion when he'd seen Nathan and then controlled it, the conversations he'd had alone in the shop at 2 a.m. when the work wasn't going well, and the distance between what he was doing and what he was trying to do felt too wide to cross. Those things were real. They didn't disappear because the patent was reattributed, or because the race result was in the record, or because Priya Mehta's suspension rig was assembling itself in the bay next door. What had also happened was this. He had spent 3 years building something no one had asked him to build, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate to anyone else, in conditions that offered no guarantees. And the thing he'd built had held up under 312 miles of desert in 112 degrees. And the record now said what it was supposed to say, and there were 4 engineers in the bay next door on any given weekday who had access to something they hadn't had before. That was the shape of the accounting, incomplete like all accounting, and it was the one Nathan Cross was going to have to live in, which was fine, which was honest, which was what the work had actually produced rather than what he'd imagined it would produce when he'd been young enough to believe that right outcomes arrive in clean lines. The highway outside ran north and south. The shop was open. The coffee was still bad. The overhead light had stopped humming. He went to work,